education groups with sexually abusive youth, Streetwise to Sexuality, the new 3rd edition offered by Dr. Stephen Brown. Before turning this over to Steve, I want to take just a moment to tell you about NERI Press. Our mission is to share current research and best practices emerging in our field. For many years, we accomplished that mission only through book sales, but with changes in the last several years in the publishing and technology worlds, we've been compelled to continue our mission by expanding how we disseminate knowledge. Over the last 5 years, NERI Press has also offered online courses, a free monthly newsletter, in-person trainings, and most recently, these webinars delivered by our internationally recognized authors and other experts in the field. As part of this process, we appreciate our communication with you. We want your suggestions, ideas, and feedback, whether positive or negative, so keep those emails coming. If you find these webinars helpful, we hope you'll consider becoming a sponsor of this series. Like NPR and other public services, it's your donations that help make this series happen. If you become a sponsor of this webinar series, you will be guaranteed a seat in all webinars for the 2017-2018 series. As a sponsor, we will register you and 15 staff members from your organization for each webinar. And we will also offer you a free gift of 2 NERI Press books, Current Perspectives and Current Applications, or 2 other books if you already have these 2. It's your support that allows us to continue to bring you these free resources. Before we get started with Steve's presentation, there are a few more things I'd like to share. As with all workshops, I want to let you know the learning objectives. Participants will learn the rationale for teaching healthy sexuality groups to adolescents with sexual behavior problems, learn a methodology for leading sexuality education groups, learn innovative strategies for teaching about healthy sexuality to adolescents who have sexual behavior problems. Second, I want to let you know that the PowerPoint file will be posted on the NERI Press website shortly after the webinar is over. We'll be posting a YouTube recording of the webinar next week. Third, when the workshop is over, please answer the short survey at the end. We want your feedback so we can continue to improve our webinars. Finally, after about a week, we'll send you a follow-up email that has a link to the recordings and links to certificates of attendance, which you can download. On to the discussion. The latest edition of Dr. Brown's book, Streetwise to Sexuality, provides an easy-to-use yet comprehensive model for teaching basic human sexuality to high-risk teens. It's designed for teens in non-traditional settings who often have limited academic skills and who are resistant to classroom-based learning. Streetwise is a comprehensive sexuality education curriculum offering a range of topics relevant to teens ages 13 to 19. The 3rd edition has added new lessons on consent, sex, and internet pornography. All the lessons are simple, concrete, and actively involve group members in the learning process. They extend beyond mere factual information and address attitudes, values, and skills, an approach that research suggests is more likely to lead to positive behavior change in young people. In addition to Streetwise to Sexwise provides background information on teaching education to high-risk teens, including profiles of the sexual health concerns of 5 specific high-risk populations. And now I will introduce our speaker. Dr. Brown is the director of the Traumatic Stress Institute of the Klingberg Family Centers in Connecticut and coordinator of the Risking Connection Training Program, an international trauma training program used by organizations to implement trauma-informed care. He is a longtime sexuality educator and trainer, and he is former board chair of Stop It Now, an international sexual abuse prevention organization. Welcome, Steve.
Hello. Hi there. I guess I'm unmuted. Sitting here in my office in the basement of New Britain, Connecticut. Thank you for inviting me. Thanking you for bringing me to your computers. And thanks to NERI for this opportunity. So I want to start this presentation. Well, you can see my comic right here. I'll hopefully give you a little bit of humorous interludes throughout this presentation. We got to figure out ways to make these a little bit more engaging, so this is my opportunity to do so. So where I want to start is I want to first set sexuality education a bit within the context of treatment for sexually abusive youth and a little bit of the treatment kind of history with sexually abusive youth. I worked in a residential treatment program for juvenile sex offenders back in the late 80s, early 90s. I've been doing psychosexual evaluations for a long time. I've sort of followed the field pretty closely, and I always have been struck by about how particularly the traditional models of providing treatment for sexually abusive youth really conflicted with much of my training as a sexuality educator, as a trainer, as a person sort of trying to promote healthy sexuality. And there was one experience that really epitomized this, and I'll kind of read you my description of this interaction with a 17-year-old boy who was about a month before discharge. He had been in our program for 2 years, and by our standards there, he had really been quite successful in our treatment program. He was sort of one of our treatment stars. So the conversation went like this. I asked him, "So, Chris, what do you think it'll be like out there in the real world when you start to meet girls your age?" This happened to be a kind of heterosexual kid. And he replied, "I'm looking forward to it." Then I asked, "Well, what if you meet someone you really like? You're attracted to her and you guys really hit it off?" He immediately interrupted me saying, "Well, nothing will happen. I'll just use my urge control I've learned here." So I pressed him a little further. "But let's say you really like her. You might like to ask her out on a date. You guys go out on a date, and at some point you both might want to kiss, make out, maybe even go further." Anxious and searching for the right answer, he said, well, I'll make sure I don't do anything, or I'll keep my relapse prevention plan in mind. "Well, what does your relapse prevention plan say?" And he says, "It says to avoid situations where I might be with someone who fits my victim profile." "So, Chris, what again is your victim profile?" I asked. He said, "Well, little girls that are the same age as my victim." And I said, "So how's that going to help you with a girl your own age who you're attracted to?" Seeming frustrated, he blurted out, I don't know. I guess I'll just use my urge control. Nothing will happen. Don't worry. I'm not going to do anything. I've gone too far. I've come too far to make that mistake again." And I said to myself in my mind, what have we done? And so to me, that's the background for looking at kind of first to compare what did our traditional models versus hopefully newer models, what was their beliefs, their implicit beliefs about sexuality? From traditional models that believed that problem sexual behavior primarily was about power and control, to hopefully new models that are talking about problem sexual behavior, often about related to more relational needs or attachment. In a traditional model, the emphasis on providers' control of problem sexual behavior is we need to make them stop what they're doing, and it needs to happen right now, and the way to do it is to sort of apply as much kind of control and punitive control so that this doesn't happen anymore, to hopefully a newer model that says, okay, we need to balance focus on problem sexual behavior itself, and then also about promoting social and sexual competencies. Usually in the old model, it was really about whenever we talked about sex or sexuality, it was serious, it was grave, it had to do with their offenses, as opposed to can we open it up and say sexuality is associated both with things serious, both with things harmful, ways in which kind of people are violated, and it has to do with things fun, light, humorous, that we can talk about openly. Education about sexuality focused only about consequences and dangers, how not to sexually offend, how to use your urge control, how to use your relapse prevention, how how not to get an STD, how to not get pregnant, to education that balances focus on consequences and dangers with the benefits and the pleasures. And so I often worried that our teens would come out of our programs having internalized these messages, that all sexual feelings are dangerous, sexual feelings should be avoided, treatment success equals eliminating sexual feelings, sexual arousal, if you're feeling aroused, it's a warning sign that you're about to offend, or somehow you're bad if you have sexual feelings. So coming into this, to the field in the late 80s, here I was saying, oh my God, these are the messages? And so what I wanted to do is to, and I have much of my career, or pieces of my career have been, how do I broaden a perspective about sexuality? And one place is through a book I actually wrote prior to coming into the sex offender field called Streetwise to Sexuality, but it's been used really widely and internationally by many different programs, but often by many who treat sexually abusive youth. So the edition that I'm writing right now and completing, which should be done by the summer, is the third edition. First edition was done in 1993 when I was a 28-year-old naive educator coming out of Planned Parenthood, thinking, wow, maybe I had something to kind of tell people about how to work with these kids. Little did I know it that now, 25 years later, we'd be in our third edition, that this is a manual that's been used really widely around the world, including being one of the most popular curriculums among Planned Parenthood educators in the country. So I've been obviously really pleased. And what I want to do is sort of take you briefly through kind of the manual. You'll always have to buy it yourself if you want the details, but this will give you an overview. So here are some of the settings where Streetwise is often taught, kind of settings where high-risk kids hang out. When I did my original work as a sexuality educator, I worked in all these kinds of settings. I was the one coming in from the outside and providing sex ed series for these kids in a wide variety of settings, including for some groups for sexually abusive youth. So these are the places where it tends to get used. And the third edition was really meant to update Streetwise. As you probably know, particularly if you have teenage kids, or if you work with teenagers, the speed with which the culture around sexuality and youth sexuality changes is just lightning fast. Like you could have something 3 years, 2 years later that a term that no one ever uses anymore that they used all the time before. So our effort was to really kind of update it. It hadn't been updated in over 10 years. So this is a little bit what the overview is. So we talk a little bit at the beginning about what does it mean to have a healthy sexuality mindset when working with these kids, talk about the meaning of high-risk youth, why this manual is important, how to use it. And then as the last edition, we have a number of profiles of selected youth of youth populations who tend to have concerns around sexual health issues. So these are actually 6 profiles we have: GLBTQ youth, transgender and transgender non-conforming youth, teens who have been sexually abused, sexually abusive youth, pregnant teens and parenting teens, youth involved in the commercial sexual exploitation. So this is just a point to say that Streetwise has concrete lessons about how you teach a sex ed series, but it has a lot of additional materials that really go to the intersection and the nexus of high-risk youth and sexuality. A little bit, so then we do some on principles of sexuality, trauma-informed. We talk about what trauma-informed sexuality education means. A little bit about how you create a group atmosphere conducive to learning about sexuality. We've added this time, which I'll show you a little flavor of something, we've added 3 staff training workshops. So if you are someone who purchases Streetwise and you work in a program and you want to do some staff training with the professionals who work with the kids around sexuality, around comfort talking with youth around sexuality, about how to be a kind of positive force in guiding kids, then these are the 3 workshops. And they're meant to be kind of doable not by only advanced sexuality educators or trainers, but they're meant to be doable by a clinician or a kind of a seasoned youth care worker who can pick up this manual and really teach these workshops as well as teach the lessons to the kids. And then there's a basic series for older teens, ages 14 to 19. In the previous edition, there was also a series for younger kids. This edition does not have the younger kids series. If you want to use that, teach it with younger kids, my advice would be both to look at the old manual as well as work on adaptions that you can do yourself to some of the new lessons. We talk a bit about how to use role play. And again, just a little interlude. I'm telling you the truth, sweetie. The stork brought you. Funny, on these webinars, I'm waiting for the laugh to come into my little basement here, and it just doesn't come. So, these are some kind of overriding principles for sex education. These actually, I originally wrote these for the original Streetwise. They now are the foundation of all the training manuals that the Planned Parenthood who publishes this book uses. I'm not going to belabor this, but encourage you to think about kind of which of these principles would be easy to get consensus on within your agency if you had staff together, and which ones would be harder. Would there be consensus on gender equality and greater flexibility and sex role behavior help all people reach their full potential? What would most of your staff say about that? What would they say about the idea of kind of a positive approach to sex education is the best approach? These are not necessarily easy issues to gain consensus on, but they are fundamental to this curriculum. This is a little bit about the kind of what trauma-informed sex ed groups mean. This is part of that section, and again, sort of speaks to kind of what we know about the effects of trauma and what are the implications of that knowledge for how we do our prevention groups or our sex ed groups. So, for example, when you have kids who the essence of much of their trauma experience is that their boundaries have been violated, and of course in your case they've violated others' boundaries, you want to think about your groups around really attending closely to group boundaries. How do you strike a balance between your groups being kind of open and frank but not sort of titillating? How can you balance between sort of kind of humor and fun, and yet also talk about kind of serious topics that youth need to learn about. The first one, what we know is that teens who have trauma histories are easily activated by trauma triggers. In Streetwise, I've built in a lesson where they actually make a personal safety plan at the beginning of the series. We call it a chill plan, to really think about what are the kinds of cues and triggers in this group that might set them off, and what would they do about it, and talk about those kind of things in advance rather than them facing it in the moment. We often have fidget toys. We have a sense of kind of in groups, we'll do sort of a warm-up part, and then we'll do a kind of a work part and a cool-down part. Again, all this idea that kids are gonna likely get somewhat activated by this topic. How can we build in sort of a kind of calm down part of the group so that certainly if they're in a residential, they can return to their unit without being kind of in this overly activated place. Here's the 3 staff training workshops. There's one sort of about healthy sexuality. There's one about building comfort in staff, talking to teens about sex. And the third one is really kind of how to be a kind of a mentor and take advantage of kind of learning opportunities that come up in your work with kids to kind of convey the messages that you want about sexuality, both healthy and kind of and challenging, unhealthy beliefs and behaviors. So here's just a little bit, and this is in your handout. So the principles of sex education are spelled out in more detail in your handout. But the next handout really is just a sample exercise from one of the staff training workshops. So what you see before you here on the slide is just sort of the first part of it, where it asks staff to reflect on how much of this was true for you when you were 16. What about with you work with? Is it not at all true? Is it very much true? And then probably most importantly, thinking through, so you're in this role as a staff person, what would help the youth you work with develop this quality? And so if you look at your handout, there's many different sections of this, looking at sort of human development, looking at relationships, personal skills, sexual behavior, sexual health, society, and culture. So this is a rubric that came out of the Sexuality Information Council of the United States. It's one of the national organizations that works around sexuality education. So we basically took it and made it into a kind of a worksheet and a handout for people to reflect on both their own history, the youth they work at, and how we can think about moving kids to a different place. Again, the chicken is smoking a cigarette saying, sure, you came first. You always come first. That's why I never get to come at all. Moving on. So here's a little bit about kind of our lessons for teens in the 3rd edition of Streetwise. We start again with sort of this idea of how do you manage strong feelings that could come up in this group and getting kind of people comfortable talking about this topic. I've often said that I think sex ed is the easiest thing that you can teach. If you set up a climate where kids are comfortable talking, the group runs itself. Almost sometimes I don't even stick to the curriculum because I get so many good questions that I just use that as my curriculum. If you set the conditions where kids feel safe, if you model kind of openness and frankness, kids will engage with you. We do a lesson on sexual reproductive anatomy. There's a lesson sort of on sexual health and sexual behavior. We do 2 lessons about sexual orientation, sexual identity. There's a lesson on teen pregnancy and birth control, HIV and AIDS, sexually transmitted infections and safer sex, understanding sexual consent. This is one of the new lessons. We have a dating skills lesson, relationships lesson, although kind of certainly relationship themes are weaved in throughout all the lessons. We continue to have a date rape and assertiveness skills lesson, child sexual abuse lesson. We talk about sexuality in the web and social media. This is also a new lesson about pornography and its impact on youth, young people's sexual learning. And finally, accessing sexual health services. So Streetwise's goal overall is to be comprehensive in nature, to kind of have one lesson in each of these areas that really kind of distills what are the most important kernels that kids need to know in these particular areas. So it's meant to be that way. We know that many people won't be able to teach all of these lessons, and we make some suggestions about if you're just teaching, you want to focus on pregnancy prevention, then teach these 6 lessons. If you want to focus on kind of identity, teach these lessons. If you're really kind of looking at sort of sexual violence, teach these lessons, and different ways to think about series of lessons that you might teach given the limits of your time in your agencies. So the goal again is comprehensive topics, a limited number of lessons. We know that you don't have that much time. We didn't want to have 30 lessons. We really wanted to hit critical topics. How to distill really the most important things that in each topic area. The whole methodology is very much about activity-based ways to kind of engage learners that don't necessarily learn well in traditional classroom settings. So there's not a lot of talking at kids in Streetwise. It's really all activity-based. Really aims, again, to balance this idea of sort of the good sides of sexuality and the dangers of sexuality. Kind of danger sex ed, which is what most sex ed is, quite frankly, in this country, I think doesn't really take kids seriously. They know what the good sides are. So my idea is that we need to basically take a perspective of we want to keep the good things about sexuality and sexual development. We want you to build relationships. We want you to kind of have kind of pleasure in these relationships. We want you to kind of experiment with these kind of behaviors in a safe way, and we don't want all of the bad sides. To meet needs of diverse participants, oftentimes your audience is going to be very mixed. There could be kids who I call sort of on the nerdy end of the continuum, sort of your Asperger's kind of spectrum-y kids who kind of really know very little about sexuality, and then very kids who've been having sex since they were 11 years old and sort of may not know much accurate information, but they've been experimenting for a long time. And how do you make lessons appropriate to both? And it's a challenge. Designed to be taught by program staff who are not experienced sex educators. This isn't something that you have to have a degree in health education. We really believe that, a savvy, nuanced clinician, an experienced staff person can teach these lessons, and we've seen that to be the case. Doesn't require also any extra materials such as videos or other types of things like that. So let me show you just a few tidbits of some of the lessons. I sort of focused on some of the newer lessons just to give you a flavor. Obviously, I can't teach them here, but to give you a flavor. So in the consent lesson, so just imagine there's a big wall and a sign on one wall that says sexual consent, and a sign on the wall on one place that says sexual consent, and another over here in another place it says no sexual consent. And you're basically handing out a bunch of cards that say these following things, although these are only examples. There's about a list of 20 things. And so you hand them out to the kids, and the kids, either in pairs or in small groups, they talk with each other about where these things would fit, whether they fit under sexual consent or whether they fit under no sexual consent. Obviously, early in the lesson, we define what we mean by consent. We give kind of definitions. There's a couple other activities before this one. So, for example, on the card it says, the person says, definitely, I want you to. Does that sort of represent sexual consent? If you hear that from your sex partner or not. So if the person is lying there and not saying anything, does that represent sexual consent, non-sexual consent? I'm sure you kind of get the idea, but again, what this does is it gets kids off their feet because they take their card and they go tape it under the sexual consent side and the no sexual consent side. And then you have this board up there with all of these different behavior cards or kind of these description cards, and you can talk with a large group. You can focus on particular items or not on other particular items. It gives lots and lots of of discussion possibilities related to this activity. Sometimes you will think that these activities should be one activity in the whole group, and certainly you can do it that way, or you can shorten them, or you can move through them more quickly. But this is a good example of a strategy, a methodology I use a lot when you get kind of kids to categorize things and work together to think together about how to categorize different behaviors. So this is another activity. Craig, you want to jump in? You want to jump on for a second?
Sure.
So think big group, and the kind of issue that you raise as the educator is, many people say that one of the problems with consent is consent kind of isn't sexy, and like you wouldn't how do you actually say something, or how do you actually bring it to the verbal level when you're involved in some sexual behavior with somebody? Like, what would you actually say? And, I recently did work with some mainstream, very, very highly academic teenagers around sex ed, and you tell them, okay, well, if you were going to check in with someone, you're going to ask, what would you actually say? What would be the words that came out of your mouth? Total crickets. Total crickets. Like, there's no modeling of sort of how you actually say these things. So this is towards the end of the lesson. So imagine you have this worksheet and you're going around and each person is reading one of these. So Craig and I are going to model that. Remember, we talked about this? Is this still okay?
Is this good for you?
Can I try that?
Are you comfortable with this?
Hey, should I slow down?
Do you like this?
How you doing with this?
I'm loving this. How about you?
You seem kind of not sure. What's up?
How does that feel?
Are you still liking this?
You seem quiet. Are you okay?
I feel good. Are you feeling good?
Am I going too fast?
Can I touch you there?
How are we doing?
Boy, that feels good. Can I do that to you? So again, providing actual language for kids to actually be able to take consent from the theoretical level to really enactment of like what it would mean to say kind of within in a relationship. This is hard stuff. This is hard stuff for adults. We really have this belief that, kind of, oh, you just can pick it up from somebody. You just know when they're into it, and you just move forward. And most adults don't know how to talk about these things. Another comic here. I'm Jewish, so I guess I can include this here in my presentation. Now, Moses goes to Mount Sinai and says, now, let me get this straight. You want us to cut the ends of our dicks off? So, again, a little humorous interlude. Back to Streetwise. So, here's a little bit about our lesson about pornography. So this is an activity. Again, the full worksheet is in your handout. Basically, this gets youth to look about what kinds of things can they really learn from pornography and what gets left out. So a bunch of different items down the left side, and basically kids are working in small groups or on their own or in pairs, whichever you think is more doable, talking about sort of like, is this something that they can learn from pornography or not? So possible ways of achieving sexual pleasure, I think most people would say that you can learn some things about that. Well, to the extent to which they're accurate is, an interesting point of discussion. About how to talk in advance about sex with a partner, I don't think you're going to learn that too much in pornography. So these are sort of important skills, how to say no to an unwanted sexual behavior, not exactly something that they learn from pornography. So again, it's sort of like this idea of how to have kids understand the ways in which porn sex are and are not real sex. Because essentially, you know, whether we like it or not as adults, porn is probably the most common sex education vehicle for our youth these days. It's a scary thing, but I think it's really true that, you know, porn is the primary sex educator in our culture. And I think we have to help kids to kind of make sense of that and to think critically about what they can learn and not learn. So just the sense of the lesson. So I will stop there. And I think we're going to kind of go to questions, and I'm happy to entertain any and all questions.
Thank you, Steve. Can people send in questions to us now? And while we're waiting for them, I will ask how do you work? You mentioned children with autism spectrum disorders who have difficulty participating in groups for sure. How do you modify this for work with spectrum kids?
Well, it's a good question. So I think first of all you have to kind of assess whether they can tolerate the stimuli of a group, and what size group is best for them. Are they a kid that could, you know, be with 2 or 3 other kids and do this in a kind of a smaller group where there's less stimulation? Do you want to do some of these activities one-on-one with them rather than in a group? And again, so much of the success and failure of sex ed has less to do with the content and more to do with the group kind of atmosphere and how you set that up. So I would really be thinking carefully about what have you learned about that kid, about what environments they learn well in and what environments they don't. You know, I would be thinking about making some of the activities simpler, perhaps more concrete, to using simple kind of behavioral role plays for those kids in terms of sort of helping them out with the words, helping them out with how you would do little mini dialogues about how you kind of ascertain whether someone is kind of wanting to move forward or not, or on all different discussions about use of condoms. Like, how do you begin to have these kind of conversations? Of course, as you know, if it can be sort of a little bit more kind of at least beginning as kind of formulaic, you know, sort of a little bit rule-based, at least the beginning about, you know, you say this and then you say this. There are also some sex ed curriculum specifically now for kind of Asperger's, autism spectrum folks. So I guess my idea would be, you know, kind of get those resources as well and kind of intermix them with Streetwise, because they're going to be a bit more particular to the needs of that population probably than Streetwise is.
Great.
And Craig, I'd also turn to you. You may sort of have other ideas just as you listen about how you think this would be applicable.
I think you covered some of the major approaches that I would guess just offhand, for sure. I think I would probably not commingle the spectrum kids with the non-spectrum kids because they'd have to be a different group for sure, as you were suggesting. Other interesting questions that are coming along. How much self-exposure, excuse me, wow, how much self-disclosure is appropriate?
I would say, in general, self-disclosure is not appropriate when you're doing sexuality education. So I would not be sharing things about whether I was married, whether I was not. You know, if you're a man doing sex ed, particularly with sort of a very street kind of audience, they will immediately think you're gay because you're talking about sex. I get questions in the question box about, are you gay? So I think you want to be very careful about saying, you know, I'm not talking about my personal sexual behavior. And quite frankly, in these psychoeducational groups, I don't think it's appropriate for kids to be sharing details about their sex lives either. Some kids will sort of challenge that boundary, but I think that generally the message is that we're not talking about sex, you know, our own sexual behavior, but we're learning about sexuality in general. And to me, this is like a precious thing about sex ed, is that you are really teaching via these groups so much about sexual boundaries. You know, you're talking about that, okay, I'm this a grown-up. I can talk frankly about sexuality. I can even laugh about it at times. But then I can also move back into talking about it seriously and in terms of the skills you need and in that way. And you're negotiating sort of discussion about this issue without kind of moving into too much self-disclosure or kind of making yourself out as the educator to be cool by being a little titillating. You really want to manage that boundary about you are a grown-up, you are an adult, you are the responsible person, and you can talk frankly about this topic, and you're modeling it for kids as well.
Great. Are people, educators who are offering this group, able to incorporate other materials into the group as they see fit? For example, when you were talking about the lesson regarding consent, this person is aware of a YouTube video that helps illustrate the point. What's your experience with using other materials?
I think you should feel free to do that. There's amazing videos out these days. I think you're probably talking about the consent and pee video that's been, you know, all the rage. And yeah, you're welcome to do that. We just don't include them because, you know, they're out of date so quickly. We don't want to assume that someone has internet connection. We wanted to have all the materials. If you don't have all those other things, all the materials within the manual itself. But we welcome you to do that. You may want to just clear stuff with someone in your program before you show it. Sometimes I've found that, you know, I think something's appropriate and I like to show it to somebody else just to make sure I don't have a firestorm on my hands. One thing I've learned through many years of being a sexuality educator and trainer, never underestimate the possibility of talking about sex to create a firestorm and a controversy. So always better to be careful rather than not, sort of to vet your videos first with a couple other adults before bringing them to the group.
Good advice.
You don't want to end up on the front pages of your local newspaper for being that educator who's like telling kids how to masturbate.
Another good question here. Is this curriculum provided in weekly group settings? Is it preferable for it to be a closed group or an open rolling group?
People offered in various different ways, various different formats. You know, when I did it, we did like one group a week, but you could do, you know, you could do a more intensive for a period, do 3 times a week. You could structure it in various kinds of ways. What was the second part of the question?
The second part. Should it be open? Open?
Oh yeah, open or closed? Yeah, good question. I lean generally towards closed groups, particularly when you're talking about loaded topics like sex and sexuality. You want to create a sense of safety within the group, and if you have new kids coming in and out of the group, I don't think it's I think that it's not a great thing, and it really compromises the safety. So again, that's the issue of boundaries, about the group should have a clear beginning time, should have a clear ending time. You should really think carefully about open and closed, and again, you're modeling boundaries with traumatized kids who all they know is about boundaries being violated. So the structure of your process teaching sex ed should be very framed and very boundaried, because you're looking at creating a container for difficult material.
Great. What's your thought about having all male, all female, or co-ed groups?
So in ideal worlds, I think co-ed groups are the best, because, you know, we're trying to model and have kids have experience of talking cross-gender around sexuality. And I certainly understand that within some settings, with kids who are sort of really easily activated, with, you know, where just it brings too much noise into the group and will get in the way of learning, that you may need to do a same-sex group. If you're working with younger kids, again, sort of who, you know, have less self-management skills and less ability to use their frontal lobe, then you're, you know, going to want to be thinking more about same-sex groups. But my default is mixed groups.
Great. How do you balance discussions about grooming, which has been a constant topic in our field, versus the idea of developing a relationship? How do you conceptualize that for the participants?
Well, grooming has always been a term that I've really hated about our field. You know, when I worked in residential, when something was described as grooming, it was, to me, oftentimes like same-age experimentation with flirting and trying to kind of engage in social skills with peers. You know, grooming is often has this, you know, has the sense of, you know, it goes to intention about what is the purpose, what is the underlying intention of this behavior with peers. So, you know, I certainly understand that it's real, that it's a dynamic, and that you want to watch for it. But I don't spend a lot of time talking about kind of grooming in sex ed groups. I think that's probably a topic more for your more clinical treatment groups to talk about that concept. You know, clearly if you're watching interactions between kids and, you know, they are, you know, seeming to kind of target a particular kid, and, you know, there's kinds of dynamics that you observe, then you certainly want to kind of be aware of that. But it's not, you know, I'm really looking about teaching social and sexual competencies, and, you know, in my mind, what is oftentimes grooming is the way that what's described as grooming is kids trying to kind of learn sexual and social competencies, which is something we all have to learn in our developmental process.
Great. Here's a question from someone who's a program manager in a school for girls who are trauma reactive. How would you try to contain discussions about sexuality to your group and not have them kind of spill over into the school setting?
Well, I guess I'll say a couple things. I would, if you thought it was destructive, I would set up ground rules around it up front in the groups, and there is a place in the first lesson where you're setting ground rules, and then I bring my piece of newsprint to every single group and remind them of the ground rules whenever I start the next group. And I hold them accountable to the ground rules when people in the group are violating them. I think having sort of a kind of a flow to your groups where you're kind of have, again, sort of warm up, and then you sort of have sort of the main part of the group, but at the end of the group you are sort of doing containment stuff, you're helping them calm down, you're asking them, talking with them about kind of where they're going to class next, what's their next activity. You're sort of helping them with the transition from this fairly unique group back into the population. So, those are the things that I think of. If it's a very highly active, easily activated group, you again sort of want to, as you teach, you're wanting to kind of monitor the temperature level of the group. And so at certain times you may choose not to do an activity or cut an activity short in order to kind of regulate the activity, the activation level of the people in the group. At the same time, I will say that, in particular settings, for example, residential settings, I actually think it's a good thing that kids are going and talking about these topics. Of course, not saying Johnny said this, Johnny said that, because that violates our confidentiality rules. But some of the best conversations happen back on the units because kids now get a message from the system that, oh, you mean we can ask questions about this? We can talk about this? And so they'll pull a staff person about it and they say, like, in group, I heard this. Like, what does that really mean? And so this is where the staff training in advance with the members of your staff can be invaluable, because then you're making them more askable adults back on the unit, and you're kind of providing a more informal setting for kids to get their questions answered. So to me, that's the beauty of sex ed groups, and that kids will sort of go back and seek out information with the adults that spend most of the time with them, not the sex educator who's not with them, who's with them just that for a shortened period of time. Even better if you can have staff sit in and help kind of with the leadership of small groups, like staff from the unit. Have them come in and help, and not observe from the outside, but have them lead small group discussions. So then the kids see them again as these askable people, and I can talk with them, so that back on the unit they can ask questions in a more informal way.
One of the issues you alluded to was very young children who have a whole lot of sexual experience, not a whole lot of information, and not a whole lot of awareness about mutual respect and so on. How do you address the casual hookup culture in the way that intimacy is almost gone from the whole procedure?
Yeah, I mean that's a big issue, whether you work in our programs or not. I think my goal would be to just see if you can help them critically examine what the upsides and the downsides of hookup culture are, and have them again in a concrete way to sort of think critically about what the good sides and bad sides are. Certainly upsides is that you can sort of have easy sex, and some of the downsides is, particularly if you're our population, is like you're involved in hookup culture. There's not tend to be a lot of verbal conversation that goes on in hookup culture. And so what if you're accused of sexual assault with somebody and you have the history that you have? That to me is a huge risk factor that our kids need to be aware of. That you know, that if you know someone well and you form some kind of trust and relationship, you're much less likely to get accused, perhaps falsely, of sexual assault. So, you know, there's not a particular lesson around that, but I think you raise a really, really important issue, and then in other sex ed groups we've done some talking about sort of what are the upsides and downsides.
All right, one final question for a relatively brief answer if you can. Who should conduct this curriculum? Therapists, teachers, church leaders, or who? And which setting is most appropriate?
I really think all of the above. Again, it's not a curriculum that you need to be a highly experienced sex educator. I sort of made the activities kind of basic enough, foundational enough, both for the learners but also for the teachers. So I think all of those folks can do it. Certainly, reading a number of books about sexuality education for youth. Some of the actual books for youth, I think, are the best to read because you get a sample of what the language is that the author is using for those kids to help communicate well. But I think it's appropriate for all those people to teach it in all those settings.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate your taking the time to join us. And I have we'll have a little virtual round for you. And now I have just a few comments before we end the webinar. We have limited paid CE credits for our May and June webinars. They're available for psychologists and social workers for the final webinars of this season, which is May and June. For details about how to obtain the credits, please visit www.nearypress.org/webinars, and please read through our new CE process before emailing Kristen with any questions that you might have. Her email kind of gets overloaded if we rely on her to answer all questions. I also want to let you know that Neary Press publishes a free e-newsletter about research and practice. There we go, on the screen. All right, we're having a little technology glitches today. I'd like to take a moment to let people know that we also publish a free monthly newsletter in which we identify a current or controversial research paper and talk about the findings and the implications it might have for conditions in the field. You are automatically signed up for this resource, and we hope you'll find it useful. I know that as we read these articles on our end, they always spark discussion among those of us who work on the newsletter. If you like this webinar, you can see previous webinars on our website at www.nearypress.org. It's also possible to pay for CE credits for all past recorded webinars, and instructions are there. Next, I'd like to encourage people to become a sponsor if you find these webinars useful. As a sponsor, we will send you 2 of Neary Press's popular titles, Current Applications and Current Perspectives, or 2 new books if you've already received them. You are guaranteed a seat in our June webinar and any of the webinars in the 2017-2018 season, and organizations are guaranteed 15 staff members of their organization. We'll also do your monthly registration for you. Sponsorship is $98 for individuals, $250 for organizations. If you're interested in being a sponsor, please contact us directly at info@nearypress.org. A few quick reminders: the PowerPoint slides and recording will be posted on the website within a week, and follow-up emails will be sent within a week as well. Our organization sponsors include the following, and we thank them very much for their support, financial and otherwise. We wouldn't be able to hold this event without their support. And our individual sponsors as well have contributed to the ability to bring this information to you. A huge thank you to Steve for running this webinar for us, and a thank you to all of you for attending. We hope to see you in our final webinar in June. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.